Thank you so much for coming to the talk. My name is Shivam. I work as an Android engineer at N26. And today we'll be talking about ensuring code correctness with your own custom lint checks. Let's jump a little bit into what lint checks actually are. So back in the days of XML, if you added an image view, something like this, you would see this small yellow squiggly line on top of the image view. And if you would hover over it, you would see this warning saying that missing content description attribute on the image. Now, this was a warning that's thrown to you by the IDE, Android Studio, flagging a potential problem with the code, which in terms is about usability for accessibility reasons. So they want you to add this content description to your image view. So taking this as an example, we can think of lint as a code scanning tool that runs within your IDE. The idea is that we should be able to detect problems early, so before they actually become a problem, and then hopefully fix them. Or in some cases, it might also make sense to ignore them, and we often do this by using this suppress annotations in our code base. So what really happened and why did I start looking into writing my own lint check? So in our code base, when we write UI tests, we can add a test ID to that test so that whenever that test runs, it can report to a test reporting tool and it can say that XYZ test passed. And we can keep track of it and we can make sure that we have like an adequate number of tests passing before we make releases and so on. And if they fail, then it's also reported as a failure. So one day I thought, let me write a view model test. I will add this test ID to this view model test in the hopes that I will report this. But this test is now not getting reported to our test reporting tool. After digging in for a couple of days, asking around on Slack channels and Google Chat and looking through documentation, I find that when you want to report tests from your unit tests, you need to add this test reporter annotation to the class. So if you look here, there's an add test reporter added to the view model test. Once I did that, my test passes. Whenever my test passes, it is successfully reported to our test reporting tool. So I thought this is a problem that could potentially be solved with lint check, and in the hopes that future developers do not fall into the trap that I did, I thought let's try to solve it. So what we really want to do is to run a lint check on unit test classes. If a test class contains methods that are annotated with test ID, but the class itself is not annotated with a test reporter, we want to report an error on these test classes. And ideally, they would show up. If everything goes wrong, we want to show it up in the IDE, and hopefully the developers will add this annotation. So let's now jump into how I actually ended up writing the check. So the first thing, we are multi-module, so we start a new module called checks. And the first thing you want to do now is add an issue. An issue is basically a potential problem that you want to detect and report to the users, in our case, the developers. And we started by creating an issue. We provide an ID. In this case, I create this unit test reporting issue. Then I add a brief description and an explanation. These are basically used while your warning or while your error will be thrown to the developer or when these errors are actually reported in the IDE. Then there's a priority. This priority can go from 1 to 10. This priority is basically used to order when you have like multiple issues that are found in a file. Then you can also define the severity of the error. This can go from error, warning, and so on. And you can actually make your build, for example, fail when an error happens. But you can also ignore them depending on what your build setup is like. And then finally, we say that this is the class that's actually going to take care of detecting this issue in our code base. And in our particular case, we want to run this check on Java files and at the same time on test sources only. So we don't want to run it on normal classes because that's not where this annotation is used. So after we've created the issue, we now jump into actually creating the detector. The detector is the class that's going to be doing this detection for you by running checks on the file. In our case, we start off with extending the detector class and a source code scanner because we want to inspect source code. But at the same time, you can also use XML scanner. You can also use Gradle scanner and so on if you want to check build checks that run on those files. Now, with applicable USD types, we are telling that we only want to run this check on U-class files. So these are basically the test classes that we'll have. And then finally, we say that whenever you run this check on this file, use this test reporter annotation handler. So this is the class that's going to actually do the verification and check if those annotations do exist on the classes. And in addition, we pass the issue that we created in the previous step and the context, that's the Java context here. And we'll see in the implementation how this is used. So now we jump into the core of the problem, which is now verifying the annotations themselves. So this is the implementation. We've already provided the issue and Java context to it. We need to extend the uElement handler class, which basically tells lint that this class is going to be handling uElements. It depends a little bit on why it's called uElement is because of the way a program appears to lint checks, and they build like an internal syntax tree and so on. And in our case, the class is represented as a uElement. And then, because we previously defined in the last step that we want to be running these checks on classes, here we implement the visit class function. You have other similar functions that you can override if you want to do other kinds of checks. So now, assuming that everything has worked fine so far, and we have the class now accessible, which is the node in this case, we now want to validate if everything works as expected and all the expected annotations are there. How we do this is that these are two extension methods I wrote. The first one is basically that it checks if this particular class has methods that are annotated with the test ID. This is a very simple method. We just iterate over all the methods available in the class and check if it has the annotation. And then on the class itself, we check if it does not have the test reporter annotation. These are two conditions that we defined initially. And when this case becomes true together, then we want to report an error into the IDE. Now, reporting the error is the last step. First of all, we say which issue we want to report. This was provided to us in the class constructor. The scope in this case is the node where we want to display this error. In our case, this is the class itself because we want to show the error on the class. So we provide the class itself as the node. If you have some suppress warnings and suppress errors added to your class, they will be ignored by using this node. And then finally, the location. The location is, then again, we are getting the location of where we want to display this error message. And the message finally will throw what is the exact message that we want to show. We get this message from the issue that we initially have. Here we provide text format .text. I think there's also a possibility to show HTML messages and so on. With that, we are done with the implementation part. So let's now jump into how we are going to test this. Based on my personal experience, it's best to write tests. And while you're developing, it's very easy to test with your actual test rather than actually test it in the IDE, because you need to be constantly syncing your rules to apply in the IDE. To test, we start off by saying that let's assume that this is our sample class. We have a test class. It has a test that's implemented with a test ID, that's annotated with the test ID. And in this case, if we notice that the test class itself is not annotated with the test reporter annotation, so what we expect when we actually run the lint on the test file along with the issue, that this expected error should be shown. In this case, it should show that this so-and-so error is available on the vModel test. And you can also mention that we are expecting an error count of 1 and the actual error message that should be displayed along with the error. If we go back to the previous slide, you also notice that we have some annotation stubs that were provided to the files method. These annotation stubs are also stubs of this annotation being available in the path when you're basically running these checks. So it's a simple sort of stub that I created instead of using the actual annotation from the packages. So we have two in this case. We have the test ID and we have the test reporter. Perfect. So now we've implemented it. Now we've tested it. It seems to work fine. So now we are trying to make this visible to our IDE. So the first thing we create is create this issue registry. Here we want to give a list of all the issues that we want to detect. In our case, it's the unit test reporter detector.issue. We can provide a list here if you have multiple issues that you want to detect. And then finally, we add this specific file at this specific place. This is the service locator pattern, which basically makes these lint checks visible to the IDE, and the IDE will look for this issue registry at this location. So once you're done with this, you can apply this check to other modules by adding this lint checks in your dependency and using the project where you build this check. And finally, to actually make it sync, if you don't do this, if you don't run lint with this command, then this does not actually start showing up in the IDE. And at the same time, when you run this lint command, you can see these errors in the build itself or in the terminal itself. And once you've synced it successfully, then they will start to show up in the IDE. Let's jump into a quick demo. So in this case, it's a sample project that I created. We have a view model test. It adds the test reporter at the moment, and it has the test ID and test annotations correctly. If I were to remove this, then you see that there's an error that's showing up on the class. And you see this error message that basically says that unit test classes containing tests annotated with test ID should be annotated with test reporter. This is the message that I described while creating the issue. And without this annotation, test results will not be reported. Another kind of benefit, or one thing that we've not yet seen in the code sample, is that I added a fix for it. So if you press Command Enter, it shows you the suggestion, which basically says annotate with @test_reporter. And if you do this, it'll automatically add @test_reporter annotation to the class. Now let's jump into Android tests, because when you're writing UI tests, this thing is already implemented, and we don't necessarily need to be doing these checks there. So let's do a quick check here, and as you can see, there's no annotation added here for test reporter, but still there's no test reported. There's no error reported. How do we do that? There's a lint.xml defined at the root of my repository, and here I'm basically saying that the ID that I defined for the issue, I ignore it for all the paths that are available in Android test. So what this does is now that it runs the test on all the test sources and Java classes that do not exist in the path that's Android test. So anything else that exists in the test, they will be run with this issue, tested with this issue. Here's a QR code of the sample project if you just want to take a quick picture. There's a lot more details, edge cases, and so on handled within the project. Yeah, and some details of how I build those extension methods are available there, but in the essence of time, I'm skipping the descriptions here. Finally, some very important references. I think because lint is not such a popular topic, I would say it's kind of hard to find a lot of source code out there or sample code out there. And the best, from my practical experience, the best source that I've found is the official guidebook that's available on the Google samples. It's a very good documentation. It's available in the form of like an ebook, and you can just go through it, read it. It's quite big. You can also see a list of all the rules that come pre-packaged in Android Studio. And when you want to start writing your own custom rules, it's really helpful if you start by actually looking at one of these rules that's already available and referring to them and use them as a starting point. Because there are some gotchas and some methods that you would think should be used for X purposes, but when you actually read the documentation, it completely says that it shouldn't be used for that purposes. So yeah, the docs are very helpful in that case. It happened to me in my particular implementation as well. Along with the custom lint rules, you can also see a bunch of lint checks that are already written by the community. In case we have some from, in our case, we have some from Uber. We also have some from Slack. These are also specific to Compose. So if you're trying to migrate a new code base and you want to prevent these gotchas or that developers can fall into while kind of like migrating from XML to Compose implementations, you can use these as a helper and potentially preventing problems. And finally, there's another implementation of lint by Jake Warden. So if you use Timber and you try to use log messages with Timber, for example, you will see that it complains. So a couple of like references for you to check. And yeah, hopefully this helps you in improving your code base and making your code base better and helping developers write correct code. And that's all from me. So thank you so much for joining. You can check out my Twitter, text me there if you have any problems, and so on. I'll try my best to help. Thanks again for joining.